Good evening. We're live from day 3 of Raisina here, and this panel is called Technology in a Troubled World, Peacekeeper or Weapon. I have two brilliant panelists with me. To my right is Renata Dwan, the director of UNIDA, and to her right is Bright Gemelli, who heads security at Internet Solutions in Kenya. Technology is at the forefront of all conversations right now globally. Trust in technology is at an all-time low. How do we deal with this reality? Renata, let me turn to you first. There has been a lot of talk about writing the rules of road for stability in cyberspace, and norms are being seen as a critical vessel in ensuring that countries keep to the line, ensure that they don't use technology to disrupt a global network that everyone is dependent on. Mm-hmm. How do you see the effectiveness of cyber norms, and how do you think we can include the outlier countries who don't subscribe to the same rules of the road that most of the rest of the world does?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question, because to some extent we're inclined to approach issues around technology as if it's a completely new domain. Whereas the question you ask could be asked about any aspect of international law. How do we get outliers to follow rules of the road in our countries? How do we get countries who are not following international human rights law to follow that? So I think it's important that we see tech in a context of a broader discussion about norms. That being said, part of why norms are so difficult in technology, and especially in digital, is because it's moving so quickly. And so countries are cautious about setting norms when they're not sure about the strategic advantage or the disadvantage it might put them at. And second, because they're not necessarily in control or even indeed in the driving seat of technological development, where we see private state actors, non-state actors, companies, and even individuals really driving the technology forward. So where do I think we are at? Well, in this round of just our conversation, I'll say at the outset that I think there's been a good bit of work at the international level in talking about some of the norms as to what they could be, particularly around supply chain guarantees, vulnerability disclosures, certain actions, agreeing not to hack certain areas of critical infrastructure, emergency services and others. Where we've lacked is being able to really get agreement on that and move forward towards implementation and sustained exchange on implementation. There's a new opportunity now where there's agreement that some processes are going to start at the UN again. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have to really push member states to try to come together to move quickly. I think there's two arguments we need to bring. Is one, if states don't go forward and look to really establish in place mechanisms, private sector is going to move ahead of them. Mm-hmm. And civil society and actors are going. So in a way, the relevancy of the state is going to have to be to try to move forward in this. And two, I think public opinion needs to push actors and states and governments and authorities in this direction.
Right. Before I move to Bright, I just have one follow-up on that. Because we've had limited success in scripting these norms in multilateral fora conversations, do you think it might be more effective if global tech companies take the lead in scripting some of these norms, because they work across geographies, so the rules that are written in different parts of the world affect them across the board?
Absolutely, although some might argue that's a bit like asking the fox to be in charge of the hen house. No, but I think to really look at it, for me, there's not any one single actor. I don't think this is a process that can be led only by states. Yeah. I think this is a process where you're going to have to see the private sector move. You're going to have to see civil society, you're going to have to see academia, training, capacity, and you're going to have to see governments interact. The difficulty is, and that's where I think there's a fundamental tension, governments and countries have different views about the relationship they want to have with the private sector. And that, I think, is a real challenge going forward.
That's really true. Data is very expensive, and right now everybody's trying to fight the fact that they want to keep some of the data to themselves. Mm-hmm. Just the way every country has a border, they try to not let other people come in and try to grab something that is very confidential to them. So trying to work with all is the same thing with all the private organizations. Look at Facebook, look at Google, look at Twitter. For example, about 5 years ago, before the whole Cambridge Analytica situation happened, there was a possibility that you can actually use Facebook to get certain information about people you're not supposed to get, right? Facebook has changed that right now, which is making them better. others like Twitter and the rest have not made that much change. And I was trying to find out, are there conversations that are happening to make sure that the same rules or the same practices are being shared across all the other players? Same thing now has to do with governments. Do they don't want to actually make sure that things are too open, that they can't put too many sanctions to be able to let this become a free flow? Data protection being one of the areas that is being discussed right now. Let's look at a few African countries. Ghana and a few others are the only ones that have implemented data protection. Others are having discussions that are going on. But are the conversations that are happening to try to synergize all of these together to come together as one. But again, that conflict of interest of having the little, I don't trust you kind of feeling is always there to make sure that people don't take too much of what they don't, I mean, they don't want to share too much of what they have.
Of course, and that's an important aspect of the conversation. In fact, let me throw back to WannaCry.
Yes.
The fact that it emerged from Eternal Blue, that was an NSA 0 day that had been developed.
Yes.
We have talked a lot about, over the last 2 years at least, accountability of the big tech companies and how they handle data, how they ensure privacy and so on.
Yeah.
What about accountability within the network centers of the world, China and the United States, where a lot of the technology emerges and where there are unintended fallouts of the technologies that they have built?
Yeah.
How can the rest of the emerging world, for instance, hold them accountable, because they're also, affected by this fallout?
Yeah, just as Renata said earlier on, that technology is moving so fast that we don't even know how much it's going to do. I'll take it back to somewhere like Kenya. When the fiber optic cables came in to land at the port in about 5 or 6 years ago, it changed the way developers started doing work. It started making people develop more softwares, people started doing more businesses, and connectivity to other countries is becoming more prevalent. Here's the case: advanced persistent threat attacks, which is now coming from places like China, Russia, or North Korea, that people, just speculating that. It's becoming a very interesting thing that they can't stop right now, because state-sponsored attacks are not things that are done in a month or two. It takes months, it takes years for them to plan very well to be able to execute that. So things like WannaCry coming out, and it's actually a tool that was designed for the NSA before it leaked out. Here's the people are taking advantage of that to make sure that they can actually use it for other things that we're not really supposed to be concerned about. You see, but even before WannaCry came out, Microsoft, for example, released a patch for people to use. But just because there has not been enough conversations between the countries, organizations, they were not able to spread out that notification to a lot of people. And here is the case, became a global problem, So that's why I see some of those coming up right now.
If I could on this, I come from a small country, and I come from a country, Ireland, where its wealth is based on openness and multilateral processes. So I think it's absolutely critical for smaller countries and countries with less developed sort of industries and capabilities in this sense to push for multilateral processes and systems, because it's the only way that smaller actors have to lay claim to justice, support, information capabilities. And I think that's why this idea of multilateral engagement on responsible state behavior is absolutely critical. It's also, as you said, gives smaller countries access to capabilities from private corporations, that information that they might need in the event of attack. And what this is really, I think, getting, and we were just chatting about this, is that we need to change a mindset away from not that such attacks shouldn't happen, although we want to create as much dissuasion as possible. But how do we build collective resilience so that we have a global community that can respond quickly and communicate and use that very interconnectivity to help each other in an open way? And for me, that is what's most interesting about digital tech, is that it's forcing us to maybe rethink security, rethink vulnerability. Maybe there's strength in being open about where you have vulnerabilities, because then you have you can appeal to the Microsofts, or you can appeal to perhaps to other governments to exchange. And how do we understand vulnerability as much as a strength as a weakness?
Really quickly, Bright mentioned earlier how technology is growing at a pace that it's really hard to keep up with it. And this rethinking structures that we have is going to be even more important as emerging technologies roll out.
Yeah.
So this lack of trust that has now become sort of emblematic of all big tech, how do you see that affecting emerging technologies like artificial intelligence? Just very quickly.
Yeah. AI is going to revolutionize how things work, especially in the cybersecurity world. Everybody trying to automate, because when you automate something, it helps you to achieve some results very fast, faster than you expected. That is going to become a problem very soon, because if an AI is doing something, the cyber laws are not going to apply to them. Or you don't know who owns it to say, like, look, it was a machine that did that, you know. And how are you going to make sure that you can prosecute something like that? Right. So we need to start having conversations of how we're going to regulate even how AI is being rolled out and machine learning kind of things being rolled out, rather than just letting it come out that way. Otherwise, before we know, the technology will go faster. Again, as fast as it's going, we need to make sure that we are actually ready for that. And that conversation needs to start right now.
I think that's right, and I think there are some conversations, but they're a little bit separate. There's an AI autonomy conversation here, and there's a cybersecurity conversation. But how do they come together? On your question about trust, for me, I think this is happening at all levels of society. It's happening at the level between communities, we see that on Facebook, we see that around issues around hate speech, we've seen it around countries and their governments and intrusion on elections and undermining faith in your national institutions. We see it at the regional level and we see it at the global level. So I don't think we can identify any one locus about building trust. I think we have to move to build resilience at all levels, and one of them is starting at people's individual awareness, training, raising and capacity, and there I think it's absolutely critical on countries like India that are in a development stage or different levels of developments, urban, rural, to really focus on that awareness and that raising just as much as in developed older economies.
Perfect. A lot to think about there, and absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank both of my panelists for their brilliant comments. We are out of time, unfortunately, so we'll have to wrap this up. You can follow more of the conversation on #Raisina2019 on all platforms. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.